The wind screamed across the frozen plains of Cathara 7, like a living thing, hungry and cruel and without mercy. Cyreth pressed her body against the ground, and felt the ice crawling up her silver scales like tiny fingers of death reaching for her heart. She was cold in a way that went beyond anything she had ever known, cold that reached past her flesh and into her bones and into the deep electric pulse that kept her blood moving through her veins. Beside her, connected by chains that weighed more than most creatures on this world, her twin brother, Korath, lay on his side, with his obsidian scales coated in frost and his breathing shallow and weak. They had been chained here for 6 cycles now, staked to the frozen ground by neutronium bolts driven deep into the rock, their wings locked flat against their bodies by gravitic suppressors that hummed with a low and constant cruelty. The Dreth slavers had done something worse than chains, though. Burned the fire out of them. Cyreth remembered the day they had forced the chemical mixture into her throat, how it had seared through her fire glands and killed them dead, how she had screamed a roar with no flame behind it, and how the Dreth handlers had laughed, because a dragon without fire was just a very large lizard to them. Korath had fought harder than she did when they came for his fire, and they had broken his rear leg for the trouble, and that break had never healed right. And now, 6 cycles later, the bone was infected, and the infection was spreading. Cyreth reached through the telepathic bond that connected her to her brother, the twin link that had existed between them since before they hatched, and she pushed warmth toward him. Not real warmth, because she had none left to give, but the memory of warmth, the idea of it, the feeling of 3 suns on their scales, in the sky cities of Veilcor, before everything ended. Korath's thoughts came back slow and muddy like a voice underwater. "Stop wasting your energy on me, sister." "I am not wasting anything," she sent back. "I am keeping you alive." "You are keeping a corpse warm," he replied, and there was no anger in it, just a terrible, honest sadness that cut her deeper than any chain. The storm they called a pale scream had been building for hours, and now it had arrived in full fury. The temperature was dropping past the point where Velkhori biology could survive, because their bodies ran on bioelectric currents that flowed through their blood like rivers of lightning, and when ice formed on their scales, it disrupted those currents the way frost kills a wire. Cyreth could feel it happening, little jolts of numbness spreading through her limbs, her tail going dead, her left wing losing all sensation beneath the suppressor clamp. She thought about how they had ended up here. The Velkhori purge had come without warning, a coordinated assault by the Dreth Dominion, who wanted the Helion 9 that lived inside Velkhori bones, a rare element that made faster-than-light travel possible and made dragons worth more dead than alive. The Sky Cities fell in 3 days. Thousands of her kind were slaughtered and rendered down to their bones in processing plants that ran day and night. The lucky ones died fast. The unlucky ones, like Cyreth and Korath, were kept alive because living bone produced Helion 9 at a slow but steady rate. And so they became generators, chained and drained and kept breathing, only because their suffering was profitable. And then even that had ended, not with freedom, but with abandonment. A territorial dispute between Dreth warlords had forced the slavers to evacuate this outpost in a hurry, and the twins were too dangerous to move and too valuable to waste a mercy kill on, so they were simply left behind, staked to the ground in the path of a storm that would do the killing for. Free. Cyreth had stopped hoping a long time ago. Hope was a luxury for creatures who had something to hope for, and she had nothing. No home, because Veilcor was a graveyard now. No people, because the scattered survivors were in chains across a dozen worlds. No fire, because that had been taken from her in a metal room that smelled like chemicals and pain. All she had was Korath, and Korath was dying. She felt his thoughts growing dimmer through the bond, like a candle flame shrinking in a draft. And she wrapped herself tighter around him, pressing her long neck over his, covering as much of his body with hers as she could. "Stay with me," she sent. "I am tired, Cyrith." "I know, but stay with me anyway." "Why?" She did not have an answer for that. She opened her mouth and roared into the storm, not because she thought anyone would hear, but because she was a dragon, and dragons do not die quietly, even when their fire has been stolen. Their wings have been locked, and their bodies have been chained to the ground on a frozen world that was never meant for them. The storm swallowed her voice whole, and gave nothing back. Korath's thoughts went quiet. Not gone, not yet, but quiet in the way that told her he had stopped fighting, and was letting the cold take him somewhere softer. Cyrith closed her eyes. She pressed her face against her brother's neck, and she let the ice climb higher on her scales. And she thought about the sky cities one last time. The crystal spires catching 3 suns, the sound of 1,000 wings beating in formation, the warmth of fire shared between kin on a cold night. That was the world that was gone. This frozen ground with its chains and its silence was the world that was left. She accepted it. She let go. And then something impossible happened. A light appeared in the storm. It was small and low to the ground, not a ship's searchlight, or a drone scanner beam, but something handheld, something carried by a creature walking on 2 legs through a storm that should have killed anything without armor plating and a fusion core. Cyrith opened one eye. The light bobbed and weaved through the whiteout, disappearing behind curtains of snow, and then reappearing closer each time, and attached to it was a shape, small compared to her, wrapped in a suit that was already coated in ice, moving forward with the kind of stubborn, steady gait that said this creature had been walking for a long time, and intended to keep walking until it reached wherever it was going, or until it died. And maybe not even then. No sane creature walked through a pale scream. No rational being crossed open ground in conditions like these, on foot, with nothing but a handlight, and whatever stubbornness lived inside its small and fragile body. Cyrith did not know what she was looking at, but the galaxy would later have a word for it. Human. Captain Marin Coyle had been talking to herself for the last 40 minutes, and she saw no reason to stop now. Left foot, right foot, left foot. Do not fall down, do not be stupid. Keep moving, Marin, keep your legs under you, because if you sit down in this mess, you are never getting back up. She was 42 years old, 5'6", built like someone who had spent too many years eating ship rations and hauling scrap metal through cargo bays. And she was walking through a storm that the local weather system had classified as unsurvivable for all known biological organisms, which she thought was a bit dramatic, but not entirely wrong. Her ship, the Beggar's Luck, was sitting 2 kilometers behind her, with a cracked thermal manifold that had turned her engine into a very expensive paperweight, and the only chance she had of finding a replacement part was the Dreth outpost that her scanner said was somewhere ahead of her in this white, screaming nothing. Broke. She owed money to 3 different port authorities and a fuel merchant on Tannic Ring, who had made it very clear that the next time she docked without payment, he would take her ship apart, bolt by bolt, and sell it for scrap. She was alone, because her last crew member had quit 4 months ago, after Marin had accepted a salvage job that turned out to be in an active minefield, and the woman had said, "I would rather be unemployed than dead," which Marin thought was a perfectly reasonable position. So here she was, one human being, walking through a frozen hell on a planet nobody cared about, because the universe had a sense of humor, and that humor was mostly aimed at her. Her suit beeped a warning. Thermal layer failure in the left leg panel. "Oh, wonderful," she said to no one. "That is exactly what I needed right now. Thank you very much." She kept walking. The handlight cut a small cone of gold through the white, and everything beyond that cone was nothing, just noise and cold and the constant hammering pressure of wind that wanted her on the ground. And then her suit picked up something. A subsonic vibration, biological in origin, too low for human ears, but registering on her equipment as a rhythmic pulse coming from somewhere to her right, about 60 meters off her path. She stopped. The smart thing to do was to ignore it, because anything alive out here was either dying or dangerous, and either way, it was not her problem, and she had her own survival to worry about. Marin stood in the wind for 5 seconds. Then she turned right and walked toward the signal, because she was human, and humans did things like that, and she had never once in her life been accused of being smart. She found them in a shallow depression in the ground, two shapes so covered in ice and snow that at first she thought they were rock formations, and then the larger one moved, just barely, a slow shift of something, massive beneath a crust of white. Marin raised her handlight, and the beam fell across silver scales, and then dark scales, and then chains, massive chains bolted to stakes in the frozen earth, and wing clamps that glowed faintly with the blue light of gravitic technology, and two sets of eyes, one silver and one like dark amber, watching her from faces coated in frost. Dragons. She had never seen Valkyrie in person, but she had seen the briefings during her time in the Union Marines, the classification files that put them at Tier 3 Apex Predator status, the protocols that said in big red letters, "Do not engage," and "Do not approach," and "Evacuation recommended," and about 15 other ways of saying these things will kill you. They were enormous, each one longer than her ship, and even chained and half-frozen and clearly dying, they radiated a presence that made something old and primal in the back of her brain start screaming at her to run. She did not run. She looked at the chains, and she looked at the clamps, and she looked at the way the silver one had wrapped herself around the dark one, in a gesture that needed no translation, because it meant the same thing in every language the galaxy had ever produced. It meant, "I will not let you die alone." Marin stood there in the storm, and the wind tried to push her over, and her suit beeped another warning about thermal failure. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the Marine training was telling her to walk away, because these creatures were not her mission, and not her responsibility, and the risk calculation was insane. She said out loud, "Ah, hell." Then she dropped her pack and pulled out her plasma torch, and got to work. The gravitic suppressors on the wings were military-grade Dreth hardware, built to hold creatures 10 times her strength, and designed to resist exactly the kind of tampering she was about to attempt. Marin did not care what they were designed to do. Resist. She had been taking things apart since she was 9 years old, starting with her mother's water recycler on the colony ship that brought her family to the outer systems. And she had learned a long time ago that everything had a weakness if you were stubborn enough to find it. She found the power coupling on the first wing clamp, and she put the plasma torch to it, and she worked. The silver dragon watched her. Marin could feel those silver eyes on her like a physical weight, and she talked while she worked, because talking was what she did when she was scared, and she was very scared right now. "Okay, so I do not know if you can understand me, but I'm going to get these off you, and I need you to not eat me while I do it, because that would be very inconvenient for both of us." The dark one stirred, and Marin felt a wave of something hit her. Not sound, and not heat, but something in her chest, a burst of raw panic and confusion that was not hers. Stumbled back a step before she understood. They were telepathic. She had read that in the briefings too, but reading about it and feeling it were very different things. The dark dragon was afraid of her, she realized, which would have been funny if it were not so deeply sad, because she was a small, tired woman with a plasma torch, and he was a creature built for war and sky and fire. And he was afraid because every other creature that had come close to him in 6 years had come to hurt him. "Easy," she said. And she did not know if he could understand the word, but she tried to make her voice carry what she meant. "Easy, big guy. I am not here to hurt you. I promise. I am just a very stupid human who doesn't know when to walk away. She turned back to the wing clamp and kept working. The coupling gave way with a sharp crack and a shower of sparks. The silver dragon's left wing unfolded slowly, shaking, dragging across the snow, spreading wide, and trembling in the wind. And Marin heard a sound from the creature that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a roar, and it was not a cry. It was a breath. A single long breath, like someone who had been held under water for years and had finally broken the surface. Marin looked at that wing stretched out against the storm, and she looked at the other 3 clamps still locked tight. And she looked at the chains still bolted to the ground, and she knew this was going to take hours. And she knew her suit was failing, and she knew the cold was going to try to kill her before she finished. She picked up her plasma torch and moved to the next clamp. She was human. Quitting was not something her species did well. 4 hours. Marin worked for 4 hours in the throat of the storm. And in that time, she lost feeling in 3 fingers on her left hand, and her suit's thermal layer failed completely twice. And she burned through her plasma torch and had to crack it open and rewire the fuel cell into her molecular decoupler to create a cutting beam that should not have worked according to every engineering manual she had ever read, but worked anyway because she needed it to, and sometimes that was enough. The second wing clamp came off after an hour, and Korath's right wing unfolded, and the sound he made through the telepathic bond hit Sireth like a wave of water breaking over stone. Grief and relief and pain all tangled together in a knot that had no name in any language. Sireth watched the human work. She had lived for over 300 years, and in that time she had encountered dozens of species across the galaxy. The Dreth, with their cruelty and their efficiency, with their cold calculations and their endless profit margins. The Kale Confederacy, with their committees and their votes and their carefully worded resolutions that classified her people as animals, so that what was done to them would not technically be a crime. Every species she had ever known operated on the same principle. What do I gain, and what do I lose, and is the exchange worth making? This human was gaining nothing. She was losing heat and time and the feeling in her fingers and possibly her life, and she was gaining absolutely nothing in return, because 2 dying dragons on a frozen world had nothing to offer her. No payment, no alliance, no strategic value, nothing but the burden of their survival added to her own. And still she worked. Marin talked while she cut through the chains, and Sireth listened, not understanding the words yet, but understanding the tone, the rhythm of a voice that filled silence, because silence was too heavy to carry. Alone. Okay, this chain is being very rude to me, and I'm going to need it to cooperate, because I'm running out of creative ways to break things, and my hands are not doing great right now, if I'm being honest. The human's hands were shaking, Sireth noticed, not from fear, but from cold. And the skin on her fingers had gone white in patches that Sireth understood meant damage, meant the cold was eating her the way it was eating Korath and Sireth herself. And still, she did not stop. Sireth tried to understand, and she could not. Through the bond she shared fragments with Korath, who was more awake now, his thoughts clearer since the wing clamps had come off, and some of his bioelectric flow had resumed. What is it? He asked through the bond. Human, Sireth sent back. Why is it helping us? I do not know. Is it a trick? No, and Sireth was certain of this in a way she could not explain. No, it is not a trick. Spent 6 years being handled by creatures who saw her as a resource, and she had learned to read intention the way prey animals learn to read the movement of predators. By necessity, by survival. And this human carried no deception in her, no hidden angle, no calculation running behind her eyes. She was helping because they needed help. That was all. That was everything. Cyrith reached out with her telepathy, carefully because she did not want to frighten the creature, and she pushed an impression toward the human's mind. Not words, because she did not have the human's language yet, but feelings. A pulse of gratitude, wrapped around a warning that said, "The cold is killing you too." And underneath both of those, a question that meant simply, "Why?" The human stopped working. She stood up straight, and put one shaking hand against her temple, and blinked several times. And Cyrith thought she had pushed too hard, that the contact had hurt her. Looked directly at her, and her eyes were clear, and she spoke, "Because someone should have done this a long time ago, and because I am here now, and that is enough reason." Cyrith did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning perfectly, because meaning lives deeper than language. And what this human meant was written in every hour she had spent in this storm, in every finger she had lost feeling in the simple fact that she was still here, when every sane creature in the galaxy would have been gone hours ago. The last chain came free as the 4th hour ended, and Korath tried to stand, and could not, because his rear leg buckled under him, and he went down hard, and Cyrith felt his pain through the bond, like a knife in her own body. The human looked at 2 dragons she could not carry, and a ship she could not reach in time, and a storm that was not going to stop, and a suit that was running out of power. She sat down in the snow, between. She opened her pack, and pulled out a small square of material, a thermal blanket designed for one human body, thin and silver, and almost absurd in its smallness compared to the creatures beside her, and she draped it over Korath's infected leg. Then she pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around herself, and she shivered, and she stayed. She could have taken the blanket for herself. She could have wrapped herself in it and walked back toward her ship and left them here with their chains off and their chances only slightly better than before, and told herself she had done enough. She did not do that. She gave the only warmth she had to the one who needed it more, and she sat in the cold, and she waited for whatever came next. Cyrith felt something crack inside her chest. Not a bone, and not a scale, but something older and deeper. A wall she had built 6 years ago, when the fire was burned out of her, and the sky cities fell, and her people were slaughtered for the minerals in their bones. A wall she had built to keep herself alive, because hope was a poison when there was nothing to hope for. That wall broke, and what came through the crack was not fire, because that had been taken from her, but something that existed before fire, before flight, before language, the oldest thing a living creature could feel. She made a decision. She had almost no energy left, but she shifted her massive body, every movement sending pain through her frozen muscles, and she curled herself around the human, blocking the wind with her bulk, pressing her belly against the small, warm shape of this impossible, stubborn creature. Through the bond, she sent Korath one word: shield. He understood. He dragged himself forward, broken leg and all, and pressed his body against Cyrith's, and together they formed a wall of scale and bone and dragon flesh around one shivering woman who weighed less than one of their claws. The Valkyrie had not protected another species in living memory. There had never been a reason to. No one had ever given them one. Until a human sat down in the snow and gave away her only blanket and chose to stay. The storm raged on, but inside the circle of dragons the wind could not reach, and the cold could not bite. And Marin Coil closed her eyes, and her shivering slowed, and her breathing steadied, and she slept. She slept between 2 creatures that the galaxy classified as Tier 3 apex predators, and she was safer than she had been in years. Cyrith stayed awake and watched the storm, and listened to the small steady sound of the human breathing, and she thought that this sound was the most precious thing she had heard since the sky cities fell. Marin woke up warm, and that was wrong. Warm was not something that happened on Cathara 7 in the aftermath of a pale scream, and for a long confused moment She thought she was back on the beggar's luck, in her bunk, with the heating unit running, and the whole nightmare of the storm had been exactly that, a nightmare, something her tired brain had invented while she slept. Then she opened her eyes, and found herself staring directly into an eye the size of her head, silver and ancient, and watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. She was buried under dragon. Sireth had curled around her so completely that Marin was cocooned in a pocket of warmth created by the dragon's body heat. And Korath's bulk pressed against the other side and formed a second wall, and between the two of them they had kept her alive through the night. The storm was over. The world outside the circle of dragons was silent and white and still, a landscape of fresh snow, stretching to the horizon, under a pale sky that held no warmth, but at least held no malice either. Marin sat up slowly, and her body informed her of everything that had gone wrong during the night. The frost-bitten fingers that were swollen and hot with returning blood, the deep ache in her joints from hours in the cold, the raw burning in her lungs from breathing frozen air through a suit filter that had been working at half capacity. "Good morning," she said to the silver dragon, and her voice came out rough and broken. "Thank you for not rolling over on me in the night, because that would have been a really disappointing way to die." Sireth blinked, and then something happened that Marin was not expecting. An image appeared in her mind, clear and sharp and not her own, a picture of two dragons lying in snow with a small figure between them, and attached to the image was a feeling, warm and deep and unmistakable. Gratitude. "You are welcome," Marin said, and she meant it in every direction the word could travel. But there was no time for sentiment because reality was already arriving, and reality was ugly. Korath's leg was worse. Even Marin, who knew nothing about Valkyrie biology, could see that the infection had spread overnight. Dark lines running up from the shattered bone through the scales around it, and his breathing was labored in a way that spoke of fever and system failure and a body that was running out of fight. She needed to get them off this world. The beggar's luck was 2 kilometers south, with a cracked thermal manifold and a cargo hold built for freight containers, not dragons, and enough fuel for maybe 4 days at sublight, which would get her to Tannock Ring if she pushed the engines past their safety limits and did not hit anything unexpected along the way. She pulled up her suit's remote link to the ship and started running numbers. Sireth could not fit in the cargo hold with her. Wings spread, but if she folded them tight, she might just barely squeeze in. Korath was bigger, and there was no version of the math that put him inside the ship without major modifications. Marin stared at the numbers for a long time. Then she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." And she said it out loud, because she needed to hear the plan spoken in order to believe it was real. "I am going to strip the hull plating off the lower deck, which means no radiation shielding for 4 days, which means I am going to glow in the dark by the time we reach Tannock Ring. But that is a problem for future Marin, and present Marin has bigger things to worry about." She made 7 trips over the next 2 days. 7 trips between the Dreth outpost and the Beggar's Luck, 2 kilometers each way through knee-deep snow, hauling parts and supplies and pieces of the outpost that she had torn apart with her hands and her tools and her apparently inexhaustible stubbornness. She found the thermal manifold component she needed in a storage room that smelled like machine oil and cruelty. She found Dreth medical supplies with labels she could barely read, and she spent an hour with her suit's translation software piecing together what each one did, until she had assembled something that she hoped was an anti-infection treatment and not a poison. She mixed it with human antibiotics from her own medical kit, reasoning that biology was biology and infection was infection, and sometimes you just had to make a guess and commit to it. She injected Korath with the mixture and held her breath and watched, and when his fever dropped 2 degrees over the next 6 hours, She allowed herself to feel a very small and cautious hope. Cyrith helped where she could. Her telekinesis was weak from starvation and exhaustion, but she could move small objects, and she did, passing tools to Marin and holding panels in place, while the human welded and once lifting a heavy beam that had fallen across a doorway in the outpost so Marin could pass through. They developed a language between them, not a spoken language, but something built from Cyrith's telepathic impressions and Marin's constant talking, a system of feelings and gestures that grew more precise by the hour. Warmth meant yes, cold meant no, a sharp pulse meant danger, a slow rolling wave meant I am tired, and they both sent that one often. Marin learned that Cyrith's name was Cyrith because the dragon sent her the sound of it, wrapped in an image of silver scales catching sunlight, and Marin said the name out loud, and Cyrith sent back a pulse of warmth that meant, yes, that is me. And Marin said, I am Marin, and she felt clumsy sending it, but she tried to push the feeling of her own name toward the dragon, and Cyrith received it and held it, and Marin felt something in the bond shift, something that said, I know you. On the second day she got the ship running. She stripped the hull plating from the lower deck, and widened the cargo hold entrance with a cutting beam, and reinforced the floor to hold dragon weight. When she was done, the beggar's luck looked like something that had been through a war, which was not far from the truth. The hardest part was Korath. She built a sled from wreckage, metal panels welded together and lashed to a frame with cables. She rigged a harness for herself, and she dragged him, 2 kilometers through the snow, a creature that weighed more than everything she had ever carried in her life combined, on a sled she had built in 2 hours, pulled by one human being who had not slept properly in 3 days. It took 5 hours. She fell 11 times. Each time she got back up. When she finally reached the ship and looked at what she had done, the stripped hull and the jury-ringed engines and the 2 dragons crammed into a space that was never meant for them, she stood in the cargo bay door, and she was shaking, and her frostbitten fingers were bleeding inside her gloves, and every muscle in her body was screaming. She said, okay, this is either the bravest or the stupidest thing I have ever done, and it is probably both, but that is fine, because that is what humans do. She climbed into the cockpit, and fired the engines, and the beggar's luck groaned and shuddered, and lifted off the frozen ground of Cathara 7, like a wounded bird that had no business flying, but was flying anyway. As they cleared the atmosphere, and the stars appeared in the black, Cyrith sent Marin something new. Not a feeling this time, but a memory. A real memory, full and rich and heavy with detail. Cyrith showed her Veilcore. Crystal spires rising from clouds, catching the light of 3 suns, towers of glass and song that reached toward the sky like prayers made solid, and around them, thousands of them, dragons in flight, silver and gold and obsidian and emerald, filling the air with wings and fire and the sound of a civilization that had existed for 10,000 years. It was the most beautiful thing Marin had ever seen, and attached to the memory was a word, old and deep and carrying the weight of centuries. The Veilcore word for kin. Marin sat alone in her cockpit, with tears running down her face and the stars stretching out ahead of her, and a word in her heart that she did not speak, because some things are too big for a human voice. She set course for Tannock Ring and flew. The beggar's luck limped into Tannock Ring with no radiation shielding and one engine running at 60%, and a hull that looked like it had been opened with a can opener. Marin had lost the shielding 12 hours out from the station, and she had swallowed every anti-radiation pill in her medical kit, and flown the last stretch manually because the autopilot had fried somewhere around hour 30, and the ship did not trust itself to land without her hands on the controls. She docked at Bay 17, and when she opened the cargo hold door and stepped out, she looked like a woman who had been through something that did not have a name yet. The dock workers saw her first. Then they saw what was behind her. 2 Valkyrie dragons, one silver and one black, filling the cargo hold of a salvage ship that had no business carrying anything larger than freight containers. And the station fell silent in a way that Marin had never heard a station go silent before. Because Tannock Ring was a place that never stopped talking, and yet here it was, with nothing to say. The medical teams came fast. Tannock Ring was a neutral port, and its doctors had treated every species the galaxy had to offer. But none of them had ever treated a Valkyrie, because the Valkyrie were supposed to be gone, reduced to a few hundred in Dreth captivity, a species that the galaxy had quietly agreed to forget about, because remembering them meant acknowledging what had been done to them. Korath was critical. His leg infection had spread further during the flight, and his bioelectric systems were failing, and the doctors worked on him for 9 hours straight, using a combination of their own expertise and the notes Marin had scribbled on her datapad about what she had observed of Valkyrie biology during the 2 days she had spent keeping him alive. They saved his leg, they saved his life, and while they worked, the news spread across the station, and then across the sector, and then across the galaxy, the way news does when it carries the weight of something that matters, fast and unstoppable, and growing larger with every retelling. A human salvager had found 2 Valkyrie dragons chained on a frozen world, and she had freed them on foot in a pale scream, and she had dragged one of them 2 kilometers through the snow, and she had stripped her own ship bare to carry them to safety, and she had flown 4 days without radiation shielding to get them to a medical station. The galaxy reacted, and the reaction split along species lines in a way that revealed more about each species than any of them would have liked. The Dreth Dominion issued a formal demand for the return of what they called their property, because the twins were legally classified as resources under Dreth law, and the extraction of Helion-9 from their bones was a licensed commercial operation, and what this human had done was technically theft. Union received the demand, and a diplomat whose name was never recorded in the official transcripts responded with a message that was 3 words long. And those 3 words would later be printed on shirts and mugs and painted on the hulls of ships across human space. The Kale Confederacy, which had spent decades passing resolutions that classified the Valkyrie as non-sapient resource fauna, faced a crisis they had not anticipated, because footage of Cyreth speaking began circulating on every feed in the galaxy. She had learned common in fragments during the journey, pulling words from Marin's mind through the telepathic bond, and assembling them into something rough but unmistakable. The first thing she said on camera, in a language the galaxy could understand, was, "My name is Cyreth, and I am not a resource, and I am not an animal, and my people are dying in chains while you argue about whether we are real." The footage was viewed 11 billion times in 3 days. The Morvathi Trade Consortium responded with genuine confusion, and their ambassador requested a meeting with a Union diplomat. And during that meeting, the ambassador asked a question that would be quoted in history texts for generations. She gained nothing from this action, and she risked her life, and she had no treaty obligation, and no legal requirement, and no strategic incentive. So I must ask, because our entire cultural framework depends on the answer, why would any rational being do this? The human diplomat smiled and said, "You just answered your own question. She is not a rational being. She is a human being." The Morvathi ambassador stared at him for a long time, and then wrote something in his personal journal that was only discovered after his death many years later. He wrote, "I think I have been wrong about something very large for a very long time." Cyreth and Korath were granted asylum in Union space, 3 weeks after arriving at Tannock Ring. Cyreth stood before the Union Assembly and spoke. She told them about Valkor, about the Sky Cities and the 3 suns, and 10,000 years of civilization that had been reduced to bone meal in processing plants. She told them about the purge, about the ships that came without warning, and the fire that fell from the sky, and the screaming that went on for 3 days, while the galaxy watched and did nothing. She told them about the chains, about 6 years on a frozen world, with the fire burned out of her, and her brother dying beside her, and no one coming, not once, not ever. And then she told them about Marin. She said, I had given up, and my brother had given up, and we were ready to die because the galaxy had taught us that we were alone and that no one was coming. And then a light appeared in the storm. She paused, and the assembly was silent. It was small, she said, so small, a little light carried by a little creature walking through a storm that should have killed her 10 times over, and she had no claws, and no scales, and no venom, and no fire. She had nothing but a plasma torch and a stubbornness that I have never seen in any species in 300 years of living. She did not call a committee, and she did not check our species classification, and she did not calculate whether we were worth saving. She saw suffering, and she stopped. That was all. She saw suffering, and she stopped, and she stayed, and that is the most powerful thing I have ever witnessed. The assembly gave her a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes. Marin was not there. Marin was in the docking bay, loading supplies onto the beggar's luck, because she had debts to pay and a ship to fix, and she was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of being called a hero, when all she had done was the only thing she could have done. Cyreth found her there. The dragon walked through the docking bay, and the mechanics and pilots and dock workers stepped aside, because a Valkyrie walking free was still a sight that stopped people in their tracks. And Cyreth moved through them with a grace that 6 years of chains had not been able to kill. She found Marin sitting on a cargo crate, checking her manifest. You are leaving, Cyreth said, and her comment was better now, still rough, but carrying the weight of everything she meant behind the words. I have to, Marin said. I have a fuel merchant on this station who is going to take my ship apart if I do not pay him, and I have a living to make, and besides, you do not need me anymore. You are safe now. Cyreth lowered her massive head until her eye was level with Marin's face. I will always need you, she said. And then she sensed something through the bond. Not an image this time and not a memory, but a feeling, vast and warm and ancient. Something that reached back through 300 years of living and forward. Years remained. A feeling that had a name in the Valkyrie language, but no translation in any human tongue, because humans had never needed a word for it before. It was the declaration that another soul was part of your flight, your family, your fire. It meant that wherever Marin went in the galaxy, she carried a piece of Cyreth with her, and wherever Cyreth went, she carried a piece of Marin. And that bond could not be broken by distance or time or death, because it was older than all of those things. Marin put her hand on Cyreth's snout. Her fingers were still bandaged from the frostbite, and her body was still recovering from the radiation, and she was still broke and still tired, and still the same ordinary stubborn woman she had always been. She did not cry. She said, You take care of your brother, and you take care of yourself, and if anyone ever puts chains on you again, you call me, and I will come. I do not care where you are or how far it is. Cyreth closed her eyes and leaned into the touch, and for a moment in a noisy docking bay, on a busy station, in a galaxy that was vast and cold and often cruel, something was perfect. Marin flew out of Tannock Ring an hour later. She cried in the cockpit when she was alone, because she was human, and humans carry their biggest feelings in private and let them out only when no one is watching. Cyreth stood at the observation deck and watched the beggar's luck shrink to a point of light among the stars, and she thought about everything the galaxy had taught her in 300 years of living. She thought about the Dreth and their cruelty, and the Morvathi and their calculations, and the Kael and their committees, and all the ways the galaxy had found to look at suffering and decide it was someone else's problem. And she thought about a woman in a storm with a handlight. The galaxy had always measured strength in fire and in claws and in fleet tonnage, and weapons yield and the size of your empire, and the fear you could put into the hearts of your enemies. They were wrong. She knew that now. The strongest thing in the universe was a woman who could have walked past and did not.